Hi, everybody. Welcome. So good to have you here tonight. You're in for a real treat, I promise you. It's my great pleasure and honor and privilege to be able to introduce to you tonight the author who is here to talk about her new book with us, and a former student of mine and of others in this room, including Dr. Colosi. Her name is Teresa Messineo, and she's such a multi-talented, multifaceted person that I decided to go at this in three different ways, okay? You're going to get a sort of prose introduction, then I'm going to talk about poetry as an introduction, then I'm going to get to the point, okay? 1, 2, 3, P. Prose first. As all my good intro to poetry students will tell you, prose is ordinary speech. So here's the ordinary speech and the track record for Teresa Messineo. She's a DeSales University graduate. She was an English major when she was here, yay, and she was a biology minor, and she was a theology minor. While she was here, she won our Ross Baker Award for Excellence in English. You can't do any better as an English major here than to win that award. There is life after DeSales, you'll all be happy to know. She moved on and became a certified childbirth educator. She became a Lamaze breastfeeding support specialist. She homeschooled all her children. And I should, I guess, put that in the present too, past and present. She performs with all of them in their own Celtic band. She's a member of a Philippine dance troupe. You getting the picture here? Her interests extend to travel, poetry, personal fitness. She does high-intensity physical training, and last year she participated in her first triathlon. And now she's written this terrific novel, The Fire by Night. That's the prose. Now the poetry. Last year, I drove up the hill here for our annual academic excellence performance, which happens every spring in late April. It's always on a beautiful Sunday, and we all have to come back in and march in our robes and everything like that. And what usually happens is I pull into the parking lot. It's early Sunday afternoon. I usually have a baseball game on the radio. I stay in the car listening to the game as long as I can, and at the last minute rush out, put on my gown, and get in line. But this spring, as I was sitting listening to the Yankee game, I looked over and I saw Teresa get out of her van, I think, or SUV, something like that. The van wasn't important, with her daughter, with one of her kids, and she was getting her all ready for going in, and the interaction between the two of them was inexpressibly beautiful. There was a whole choreography where she was braiding her daughter's hair, and they were both sort of looking in the reflective window and then looking in the mirror and turning, and she was touching her face. I just thought it was one of the most exquisitely beautiful things I'd had the pleasure to witness in a long, long time. And that's the sort of poetry piece of this introduction. I'm trying to give you as full a vision of her as I can before you meet her. And now to the sort of main point. I emailed her this morning. I asked her, Teresa, is there anything that you would like me to say about you tonight? I said I can do it all on my own if you want, but is there anything you'd like me to mention? She wrote back, and one of the things she said was, I would be happy if you regaled everyone with stories about how ridiculously honest I was with you when she was my student, admitting openly that, this is a quote, whenever I get bored in your class, Dr. Myers, I just study the world maps on the wall. And then, one day, she says, you actually called me out on it, one drowsy afternoon, asking me, point blank while I was drifting where Tonga Tepu was. And I stood up helpfully and showed the class. What a bozo I was. Okay, so first, Teresa, you actually don't win the prize here for self-deprecation. 2 weeks ago, I got an email from an alumnus. He was recalling my intro to poetry class in which he declared what an asshat I was. And as we all know, bozo does not even come close to asshat. No, but everyone, the point is this is what I want to tell you, and I'm going to tell you directly at the risk of making you blush. You had a relentless commitment to work. You had a gymnastic and have, all this is still present tense, imagination. You have a ravenous curiosity about so many areas of human endeavor, a determined willingness to risk, a determined willingness to fail, a determined and stubborn insistence that if you fail, you must get back up and try again. You have a self-confidence twinned with a sense of humility. Plus, you are a complete bozo. That's the fullest picture I can give you tonight of our guest speaker. You will be delighted to hear her. She's tremendous fun, and she's, of course, bright, imaginative in the extreme. So would you all please help me welcome Teresa Messineo.
Thank you, Dr. Myers. Really, thank you so much. That means so much to me. Thank you, Dr. McKnight, for setting up this incredible event. It's so great to be back. I've never spoken in front of a microphone before. I'm supposed to tell you my story, how I got up here at this podium, at my own alma mater. How my book became required reading for this wickedly smart writing society. How I've changed places tonight with some of my most beloved professors. Now it's my turn to lecture to them. There are parts of my story that are public knowledge. I had the most fantastically unorthodox upbringing, for example. I went to my parents, who are here tonight, my parents' Dharma Initiative-styled school. I can't really call it a grade school because we never received grades, nor were we in a grade. I think it was last year I finally stopped counting on my fingers. Sixth grade, you're 11 years old. But out of this crazy microcosm of creativity, I transitioned into a very strict, very formal, very orthodox Catholic high school, where I learned things like higher math, how to write an essay, how to stop wearing my uniform sideways. From there, I transitioned to this prestigious institution. I had my scholarship interview with the incomparable Dr. Roger Berg, and he also administered my scholarship examination. And back then, it was a written exam. Multiple choice plus an essay question I've since figured out was worth, in today's money, about $172,000. I still remember the question. Write an essay about a microorganism that has changed the course of human history. And I sat there for a minute, biting my pencil, and thought, everybody else is going to go with bubonic plague. So I picked the slime mold that caused the Irish potato famine, and here I am today. So those are some of the parts you might already know if you read the acknowledgement section to my book, or if you've heard my podcasts, or if you knew me at the time. But there are parts you don't know, parts that nobody knows. I never thought I was smart, not ever. Sure, I earned a full scholarship to Allentown College of St. Francis DeSales, but I guess I thought you were just handing out scholarships that day. Or I had guessed really well on the exam. I had my own feelings of academic inadequacy to deal with. I don't think I gave myself enough credit for what I actually accomplished in high school. I mean, somehow I was earning A's in honors classes while remedially teaching myself, for example, math in grades 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 on my own without telling anybody. I was so scared I'd get caught. Even after I graduated, I was afraid they'd take back my diplomas. It would be another 20 years before I felt I could finally stop playing catch up. So there was that, but we all have the roles we play. And in my family, I really felt the role of the smart one was already filled by my sister, who is brilliant. She has trouble filling out the correct answer to multiple choice questions because she does not see one correct answer, she sees 100. And again, she took her licentiate, which is the Italian equivalent of an undergraduate degree, in a language she didn't speak on the first day of school. So we are just talking amazingly gifted and smart. So since the role of the smart one was already filled, I took upon myself the role of the loving one. And anyone in this room lucky enough to have been the recipient of that, a friend or a professor or my baby boy who is a senior here now, you know what I'm talking about. I can do love like nobody can. But just by chance, because I was bored, because I had $6 extra at Barnes & Noble, I took one of those Mensa's self-tests. You know, had like sequencing. I have always loved sequencing. Anybody else? Yes. I can't find a real-world application for sequencing or anyone who is willing to pay you money to figure out sequences. But the test had that and some math on it maybe and some logic stuff. I took it for kicks. And I scored in the top 2 to 3%. So I called my sister. I am incredulous. I took this test and here's my score and can you believe it? And she was like, yeah, you're really smart. Her saying that to me, that was revelatory. Like Jesus Christ saying, hey, you'd make a really good savior. You're like, what? At that time, I also didn't think I was pretty at all, but that's a speech for another day. So I took this newfound permission to be smart, or rather to acknowledge an innate talent I already possessed, and I ran with that. As in all great things, it began here. I took an online math course through DeSales. This was while homeschooling the 4 kids pre-K to 12th grade, as I've always done. I took that math class and I aced it. Okay, so far, so good. Next, I came to class here. Physically sat at a desk and raised my hand and the whole 9 yards. And by serendipity or divine providence, who do I get as my instructor but my all-time favorite professor, the man who is an academic father to me, Dr. Joe Colosi. And the man is the same. It's 20 years later and his hair is white, but he, the man, is the same. So I take microbiology with him, and I get an A. And then I take anatomy and physiology with this new professor you all have here, Dr. Robert Blumenstein. And he's great. And he's asking me as I'm walking out of class, you just got 100 on your lab practical again. I mean, you named every single bone right. Do you mind my asking how you're doing that exactly? I remember telling him, you told us what would be on the exam. You said skeletal system or cardiovascular system, and I just studied for that. You all have to understand that as a homeschool mom with 4 kids at 4 different levels, in any 30-second time period, you might be barraged with what is the capital of Kentucky, and why did my aunt get divorced, and what are the first 12 perfect squares, and what is the meaning of life? You tell me you're only going to ask me questions about the nervous system. I'm going to get all those answers right. So I finish up these prerequisites, which also included accelerated organic chemistry class through Penn State in this crazy 6 instead of 6-week format. I wrote a letter of thanks to Dr. Berg when I aced that one. But I was going for PA, physician assistant. a major that didn't even exist when I was an undergraduate here. I applied to the program here. I applied at Hershey. I got waitlisted, didn't get in, applied again, got waitlisted again. So while I was waiting, I decided to add some more to my plate, because why not? You only live once, right? And now I was smart. So I picked up Irish tenor banjo and formed a band with my kids. We joined a Philippine dance troupe and learned the incredibly difficult and actually quite dangerous tinikling dance, which is a lot like double Dutch, but they're smashing bamboo poles you have to jump in and out of and around. I ran for a while, and then I took up competitive swimming. This is all quite exhausting when I look back on it now. I was in a triathlon with my 2 boys. I went to Italy with one of my daughters to study the language. I volunteered a whole heck of a lot. And then I wrote this book. I grew up in Reading, and we have the biggest World War II encampment, I think, on the East Coast. So I grew up walking through occupied France, seeing the handsome, blonde-haired, blue-eyed German reenactors drinking beer and playing cards outside makeshift cafes. I'm used to that distinctive roar of the Mustangs as they fly by overhead. When I got older, it was fun to dance with Soviets or Navy sailors or British RAF pilots at the hangar dances at night, my own hair curled up into victory rolls. But I've always loved medicine. It was my first love, even before writing. So I was also drawn to the obscure medical tents there. I mean, most spectators go to see the mock battles, the skirmishes, the Marines raising the flag again at Iwo Jima, but I kind of like the medicine. I'd gather around the doctor and nurse reenactors who were largely in real life doctors and nurses and PAs themselves, and I'd say, okay, if someone had appendicitis, how would you treat that? How about asthma? How about typhus? And they'd be like, ooh, that'd be difficult. Without inhaled steroids, without prednisone? I mean, heck, we don't invent the cycline drugs for typhus until the war is over. So we'd sit there, we'd hash it out, figure out how we treat in 44 or 42, and I didn't realize it then, but I had begun my 7 years of research that would become the foundation for this book. People told me to stop my research. Experts in the field, curators at military medical museums told me to quit while I was ahead, that no nurse had ever served at the front line in the Second World War. And I guess I should have listened to them, but if you're getting any kind of a feel for me right now, it's probably that I'm a leap before you look kind of person. And I was so invested in my characters, in Joe and Kay, I wanted them to be real. They were already real to me. So I kept digging, looking at pictures from the National Archives. I interviewed veteran nurses and infantrymen. I finally found the documents that had remained classified until 2005, that's 60 years after the end of the war, that proved, yeah, they were there. The nurses were there at the front line, just as I had always imagined them to be. The writing came easily. Yes, there were the 7 years of research, but the writing of the novel itself came easily. It took about 6 months. No, that's not really accurate. It took 6 months writing 1.5 hours a day. I told my editor that if you condense that into a regular 40-hour work week, I wrote this thing in 10 weeks. Of course, the editing takes much longer, much longer. And my advice to these gifted writers that I've met tonight is be open to correction. Take correction well. Be open to suggestions. And realize that no matter how hard you work or how good your writing is, you will have to make corrections that you'd rather not make. For example, say it took me 3 years to find the brand name of the drug used in the Pacific for amoebic dysentery in 1943. And now I'm one of only, 6 people in the world who knows that. So I put that in my novel, and it gets edited out. And I'm using my big girl words and my reflective listening skills, and I'm saying, what I hear you saying is you would like to edit this out. And can I just validate that feeling? Like you are a parking ticket. I am validating you that much. But I would also like to say, and even with all that, it still gets edited out. So just a word to the wise there. But when the book was finally done, it found its home very quickly because here was a story that needed to be told. We homeschool, as I've mentioned, and I don't take business calls during the school day. I had just sent over the final copy of my manuscript to my agent the day before, and she had submitted it to, say, a dozen publishing houses around closing time on Tuesday. She said it could be months, a year and a half till we got a bite. So when she kept calling the next morning, Wednesday morning, I didn't pick up at first. When I finally did, I hate to say it, I think I was rude. I think I was like, what? And it had sold. HarperCollins wanted to preempt, take it off the market then and there and buy it. And I remember saying, because this was like 9 o'clock in the morning, they couldn't have read it all. It takes 9 hours to read 90,000 words. They couldn't have even finished reading it yet. And they hadn't. They just wanted it. And working with them has been a delight ever since. We have a collective consciousness as a nation that our nurses didn't do all that much during the Second World War, and there is a reason for that. If you had a father or a grandfather came back from the European War, well, that's a narrative we as Americans are familiar with. D-Day, they're liberating France, all the rest. He might have told you about it, might have even gone to Memorial Day parades with you. On the other hand, if you had an uncle or a great uncle who made it back from the Pacific, well, that might have been different, right? His hands might have been shaking. He might have self-medicated a lot with alcohol because he's coming back from a war without Geneva Conventions, something he doesn't want to remember. Maybe he doesn't even go to the fireworks on the 4th of July anymore. And then, if you had a great aunt or a grandmother who had served in the war, and you asked her years later, Grandma, you were in the Pacific, what was that like? She would have been like, oh, it was nothing, or I just did my duty, or something else self-deprecating, and we never would have realized that her reticence was because she had signed an oath of secrecy, never to reveal her wartime service for 60 years, or lose her pension and all her military benefits. So we assumed she took temperatures, and she smoothed down sheets. But of course she did so much more. She helped to win the Second World War. I could talk like this all night, but I'm supposed to read to you now. This is Kay, who is a nurse POW in Manila, Philippines. You, nurse, come. Kay turned and saw a small group of her fellow nurses being rounded up by 2 Japanese soldiers holding rifles with fixed bayonets. She walked slowly up to them, raising her eyes questioningly at her fellow female officers, wondering if the time had finally come for the morphine vials they still carried in their hair. No onlooker cried out in protest. No passerby demanded to know where the women were being taken. No one came to the rescue or even made eye contact with their captors, and the girls didn't blame them at all. To do so would be foolish, would only hasten their own deaths. There were no heroics and no heroes in this internment camp. Or if there were, they were the people who had the courage to wake up and do their duty every day without hope of remuneration or rescue or even survival. The people who secretly possessed glass vials of escape but had, as of yet, refused to use them. You come with us now. They came. There was nothing for it. One of the nurses who worked on Kay's floor reached out her hand and took hold of Kay's finger, giving it a little squeeze before the guards could see her, dropping her hand almost instantly. Kay understood. She was saying goodbye. They were ushered into the main building, then through the main door, kept always locked, out onto a little lawn, incongruous and green in a city of brown stone and dirt and rubble. "Line up," came the barked order. One of the girls crossed herself slowly, as if she really meant it, as if she knew it would be the last time she would make that familiar gesture. They lined up in front of a massive flowering vine, purple and fuchsia and obscenely beautiful in the slanting sunlight. Lined up and squared their shoulders and resisted the urge to look at the ground, at their feet, but looked up instead and met the unfeeling eyes of the enemy. Then the commander himself came out, walking briskly toward them in dress uniform, with a Filipino photographer following in his wake, clumsily carrying his equipment and apologizing and trying to keep up. So they were destined to become yet one more demoralizing image sent back to America. Censored from the newspapers, of course, but seen by the military. News of their deaths might make the front pages, but never these images. Their bloody female bodies spread out in the green grass, arms and legs splayed awkwardly, tangled together in a mess of death and beauty, and a clinging, blossoming vine. "You will take one each." Kay was surprised. The Japanese were not known for distributing blindfolds to block out the sight of a firing squad. She was handed instead a delicately designed china cup. Each girl in turn was given the same, only the pattern differed. Royal Worcester, Wedgwood, Dresden, decorated with miniature roses, embracing nymphs, blues and golds and pinks. And each priceless cup was empty. "We send a picture to your army, show them how well you are treated. Have tea party with officer." The commander came in right among them, holding his own dainty teacup. He alone held a saucer as well. He looked at the camera, pinky raised slightly, impeccable, flanked by disheveled, starving women looking down into the bottoms of their valuable cups, worthless to them without the tea and cream and sugar that would have felt like a meal in itself, that would have helped keep them alive for another day. The obsequious photographer circled the group, bowing and scraping in between shots, smiling and bowing again and thanking the commander for the honor, for the privilege, for not killing him along with the rest of his family. Kay felt nothing, even as she watched the tears roll down the smiling man's face. Then they were done. The cups were collected and the girls herded back into the enclosure. It was over. Roll was being called as they walked back into the courtyard. They had been gone longer than Kay thought. They took their regular places and stood silently, motionlessly. Around them, their fellow inmates looked at them, questions in their eyes, but even if it had not been roll call, they would not have been able to talk to them. Nurses could not talk to anyone but medical personnel under penalty of death. Nurses could not wear pants or worse, shorts. Under penalty of death, nurses could not speak to patients or outsiders or anyone or do or say or be anything. Everything was forbidden. Everything was under pain of death. For a moment, Kay was angry that she was still alive, listening to the ever-shortening list of familiar names being read and read and read again. Why hadn't they killed her just now? Why hadn't they killed her on Corregidor? Why had she been born at all? To know a few weeks' happiness with a man she would never see again, a man who had made life precious and priceless, and now without him made it even more pointless and hopeless. The names droned on. Gallagher, Amy, Gallagher, Thomas. And she looked at the people around her. Small children with broken arms slung in scraps of an old patterned dress, since they had no plaster of Paris to make casts. Another new wet berry case she hadn't noticed at the 0800 roll, the man's arms nearly bursting through the sleeves of his tattered dress shirt. One of her fellow nurses, 2 rows away, starting to sway from sheer exhaustion, slumping, being grabbed roughly by the middle-aged women on either side of her, propping her up, holding her in position, trying desperately to avoid drawing attention from the patrolling guards toward themselves, toward their children. What was the point of it all? Why not let them all go? Or why not have killed them all upon capture rather than call roll and make them stay in like this for hours and hours until they starved to death or collapsed or went mad? It was mad. It was like a bad dream, or like a good dream dreamt by a sadist. The Japanese had found the most effective way to torture, to maim, to destroy the spirit and the body all at once. Filth and squalor and isolation, and above all else, beyond all else, starvation. Always starvation. The girls had missed their evening meal while they were having their mock tea party on the lawn. Kay's 1 ounce of meat, her 5 ounces of worthless rice or rancid mush seemed like a feast now that it was denied her. Without it, she was unsure she could survive the night, or the rest of this day, or the rest of this roll call. Jackson, Jacobs, Jameson. She was dying. She was dying, and she couldn't even sit down. She couldn't even lie down and die because why? Why couldn't she die yet? Why couldn't she crack open those vials? What fine thread still tethered her to Santo Tomas, to this world, to humanity itself? An infant's cry was heard coming from her hospital ward 2 stories above. The cry went on, interminable, indomitable, floating down to them, the one conscientious objector who could not be silenced, who would defy injustice and inhumanity with his very life, with his reasonable insistence upon being heard, upon being real. The cry continued, resolute, full-throated, and something rose within Kay. She had delivered that baby this morning. Among all that death, life had come, and Kay had helped usher it into existence. She had helped that child's mother, had helped her and 200 other humans that day, each one of them equal, each equally deserving of compassion and decency and humane care, even if that was all Kay had left to give them. They were all starving, just as the death certificates had proclaimed. But Kay could see to it that, for as long as her bodies endured, her patients would not starve for goodness or tenderness, not while it was still in her power to lift or walk or even stand motionless for hours at a time. Lambert, Landon, Langley, the baby kept crying, and the sound kept Kay alive. It was as if he were screaming and crying and speaking out on her behalf, on behalf of them all, on behalf of all those forced into silence and submission. But not forever. Kay promised herself that. Not forever. She could hold on a little bit longer. She would make it through roll after all. They were up to the L's already. All she had to do was stand. When I was an undergraduate here, I switched from a biology major in the pre-med track to an English major with biology and theology as my minors. My advisor was Dr. Stephen Myers, and I adored him. It sounds trite to say that he opened up incredible new vistas for us in the realms of literature and life, but he opened up incredible new vistas for us in the realm of literature and life. I know he did for me. And one of the things he did was help us hone our journalistic skills. Writing this book was a lot like being a journalist. Being a journalist then and there and writing down what I saw. Sure, the research helped, 100%, no question. Immersing myself in that level of detail until I didn't have to think about what my pants would look like, or how the tent would be set up, or how I would treat illnesses or injuries without modern equipment or drugs. All that helped. But I think I have a really good imagination, so the conversations how the people felt, especially the women. I could see all that. I could feel all that. And I was glad I knew how to type, because the copy was coming so fast I could barely keep up. I was like a voyeur in that tent. No, I was more like a foreign correspondent, sending word back to the home front. And the fact that it was happening 75 years later didn't seem to matter. What I saw was happening right in front of me. I think we have time for another short passage, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. So start formulating yours now. I look forward to answering some good ones. There are two main characters in this book. This is the second one. This is Jo, who is a nurse on the Western Front. There was a noise outside the tent, not the muffled whispering of the captain's platoon, but talking, then yelling, unfamiliar voices, and they were coming closer to the tent. Jo stepped out quickly from behind the sheets just as half a dozen men, Rangers, barreled into the tent. They looked like supermen to Jo, each half a foot taller than Clark, who had followed behind in their wake, the blue and yellow lozenge patches on their sleeves marking them out as elite. Here were men who could face anything, overcome anything, no matter the odds. Here finally were men who could save Jo, and more importantly, save her men. But as Jo looked at them again, she realized that these were not men coming to her aid, coming to get her out of this pit of death and hopelessness. These instead were yet more men who would be demanding help of her. "Doctor!" one of the men was yelling. He was covered in blood, but it was not his own. He and another ranger held between them all that remained of their comrade. He had tourniquets on both legs and one arm, what was left of them, a blood-soaked bandage wrapped hastily around his head. His eyes were lolling backward, lost in the delirium that is on the other side of pain. Jo took one look at the boy and knew. She shook her head almost imperceptibly at his friends, at those who had struggled through who knew what to find him help. There would be no help for him. "We have no doctor, and even if we did," her voice trailed off. "Damn it, miss, we've come this far. There's got to be something." They were rolling up their sleeves, offering blood, as if this kid needed any more blood. He was red from it. They wouldn't believe that there was nothing to be done, that his body was shutting down, that no one, not even a ranger, could lose that much of himself and still survive. The boys started to convulse, and they yelled again for help, for a doctor, for a man to fix what was broken and bring their friend back to life. And then a woman, a highly trained woman, a woman who could have fixed almost anything, but knew that she could not fix this, that no one could fix this, did what no man could do. She climbed up onto the only remaining operating table, her right shoe falling off softly, curling her foot up under her, motioning for them to lay him in her arms. They resisted at first, eyes welling with tears no ranger could let fall, denying that death would defeat them after all their effort. But the injured man's body was shaking and shaking, and they gave him to her in the end. His wild eyes focused one last time, focused on the last thing he thought he'd find so far from home, on something he never thought to see again, the dark, moist eyes of an American woman, eyes that were gazing down on him like a mother's, like a lover's, like an angel's. He could see she was real, not the phantom of his pain, but real. He could feel her arms, real arms supporting him. And then there was only her, everything peripheral turning into a hazy blur, the war, the tent, even his buddies who had been more to him than family disappeared, and there was only her, looking down on him like heaven. Suddenly he was no longer scared and no longer in pain, and he wasn't even unhappy to be dying. He knew now that he was dying, because she was there, and she was real, and she was holding him, and now everything, even death, was going to be all right. "There, baby," she was saying, delicately pushing back a lock of hair that had gotten into his eye. "There, love." And those were the words his mother had used, and he was safe again. "There, sweetheart," she murmured, pulling him closer to her soft, warm body, and she was his lover, and even with his life rushing out of him, his body responded, and he wanted her, and he loved her, and he would get well and make violent love to her, and he would be happy forever, because she was not some cheap trick in Paris that helped to pass the time, but the woman of his dreams at last, a real woman, and now everything was going to be okay. He closed his eyes, and his tired body rested against hers, swaying gently, oh, so gently, back and forth on the hard table he could not feel. In the cold tent he could no longer see. The rhythm of her body relaxed him and excited him at the same time, and he was safe. The war was over. They were all going home together. "Baby, baby, baby," she whispered, her lips tickling his ear caked with blood, and his body flooded with pure bliss, with obscene pleasure, with heat and power and might. He was soaring with Uri in a Muslim paradise. He was 18 again, kissing Katie Sue, and she had taken his class ring in her tiny hand, and she was crying and saying she would wait for him. Oh, the joy of it. And that she would marry him when he came home. And then suddenly, without any pain, he was home. There was silence in the tent. They were men. They could not cry, and they could not cross the line Joe had crossed. They could not do the nothing that is everything, that no man understands, that every man craves and hates one because he craves it and needs it and cannot give it himself and cannot live without it. Her patient stared, lips parted, lusting after the caresses she had given to the stranger that she would never give to them. The Rangers, hard men of steel and iron, stood in an impotent semicircle around the woman who had given to their fallen brother the only thing she had, the only thing he needed. They looked at her as the dead boy had done only a moment before, as mercy itself, as love incarnate, but above all else, as safety in a world that absolutely terrified them. They looked at Joe and marveled at her softness and goodness and warmth. But Joe was none of those things. Not anymore. The boy was dead. The part she played was over. She pushed him away from her numb body, the front of her jumpsuit soaked through and warm with his blood, easing her way out from under the heavy weight like a prostitute getting out from under a spent John. Then, with a callousness that made even the Rangers start, she dropped the lifeless thing back onto the table, insensible, his head making a sickening thud as it hit the cold, hard metal. Anybody have questions?
So as you're writing about these women, are you observing them or are you them?
Good question. When I'm actually writing it, I'm observing them, like a journalist, like a scene just playing out in front of me. There are certain scenes that are kind of sacred in this book. The ones I read you were two of them, in that I don't actually remember writing them. I remember writing that first line. There was a noise outside the tent, and then 25 minutes later she drops the body down and it's over. So in that sense, I'm watching it. It also, of course, is largely, all writing is biographical in the sense that you can imagine how it would feel. And I won't say that women feel more than men. We just feel on so many different levels. And so by putting myself in this impossible situation, which of course is a sad situation, objectively speaking. A boy comes in, we can't save him, he dies. It happens 1,000 times a day in the war. when you meet Jo here, she has turned herself off to survive. Earlier, the girls were feeling that every day, and they couldn't sustain that level of intensity. So kind of both, Dr. Colosi. Other questions? Teresa.
Did you do a lot of the research from the war documents you found, or did you interview real nurses?
She's asking if I interviewed real people or got written transcripts, both. The transcripts were classified till 2005. By 2006 and 7, you could get a lot of them. And so I just started reading them. Anyone who was still alive, I started reading their oral transcripts. And then I was lucky enough to meet actual nurses. I'd asked it at the dinner earlier. You've heard me allude to the fact that these nurses couldn't reveal their service for 60 years, till 2005. Does anyone want to guess what the life expectancy was of a female, not in the war, just regular, New York City, eating 3 times a day? How long would I live in 1945? Any guesses?
35.
35? That is correct for pioneer days. I remember that from Little House. Anyone else? Yeah?
50.
50? I'll go with that. 54. 54 is how long you could expect to live. So the Army did the calculations. I mean, just do the math. Every single nurse is dead years and years and years before we get there, guaranteeing no woman would ever tell her story. Luckily, with nutrition and better medicine, women are still alive. I just interviewed last month, adorable little 94-year-old nurse, lives alone, answered the doorbell herself, spunky little person. Meeting the nurses was invaluable. Meeting them in a military tent at a reenactment was even better, because I sit with her and go, okay, where's the x-ray machine go? Is it bar soap or liquid to wash your hands? I mean, invaluable details, and they remember it all like it was yesterday. Their helmets, they don't have chin straps if you're a nurse, because it's burned off long ago from using it to wash your underwear and stuff in. Use a little pot. And so there's so many details, amazing. Anyone else?
Could you talk for a second? Your last passage was brilliant in
Thank you.
exhibiting this. The dangers of when you're writing a war novel like that, and there's death and there's desire at the same time. How important it is to not get sucked into some sentimental sweet thing where all the angels are singing and all the lights are coming up and the organ's playing.
Yes, good question. I have a very good editor, and that was something they called purple prose I had never heard of before. Something maudlin or something like a Harlequin romance type of thing. It is a fine line. It is hard to do. That chapter should have ended with the Rangers looking at her in awe, right? It should have ended on a happy note. She brought peace to this boy. This is a beautiful scene. He's with Katie Sue again, right? He's found his peace. And it doesn't. It ends with her just dropping him and going back and doing her next shift, because this is 1945 and she's the last nurse standing, and I got to take care of a room full of 6 people. It was a little harder with Kay, with the nurse who is in the Pacific, because she gets there before Pearl Harbor, and it actually is idyllic. It was a dream assignment. Pearl Harbor was where everyone wanted to go. 4-hour shifts, because it's too hot to work anymore. No stockings. That was so scandalous, but you didn't have to wear stockings because of the rashes and stuff. Only nurses in perfect health got to go. It was a plum assignment. So writing about her, she has her own servants. She has her own cabin boy. She has her own cabin above the crystal blue water. She's going to galas and parties and embassy dinners every night. People are falling in love with her. She's a little girl from Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania, but everyone thinks she's a debutante. She has 10 suitors for every dance. A lot of that did get edited out because it was so romantic. And I think in the end it was a good move. This is a war novel. People who know me personally, all my kids included, are like, how could you have written that? It's so terrible. It's so sad. So many bad things happen. And it's a war novel. To candy coat a war novel, to make it always end up with the good guy getting the girl, the bad guy always getting punished, to make it seem like a camping trip, like most war movies, right? It's a lot of fun, you shoot a lot of things. The good guy, the main characters never die, usually gets a girl at the end. There's some hardships, but that just adds to the excitement, right? Like you had a bad quartermaster who didn't bring enough supplies. Well, if you make war look like that, we're that more likely to sign me up for the next one, right? But when you show that it's terrible, people were so upset I killed off so many characters in my book. Again, it's a war novel. I'm killing people off in the first chapter and people are dying almost up until the end. 5% of the world died. It's going to be horrific. I was glad I could get some romance, in there, but it is primarily about relationships. It is about survival. For these women, many times they are playing a dangerous game psychologically. It is not a good idea. It is not a safe idea. And if you find yourself doing this, man or woman, go over to campus ministry or go see your nurse, because it's not a good thing to do. But lots of times, especially women, can switch into that in-between world that most men, I think, really only get on drugs or with high fevers. But we can switch into that to survive. We can turn ourselves on or turn ourselves off. And when you meet these women who are in internment camps, who are isolated, everyone else in their entire hospital is dead, you turn yourself off to survive. And if you find yourself, as in certain sequences, seeing things that aren't there, and hearing things that aren't there, and talking to people who aren't there anymore, well, that's just, I'm getting through my day. These were incredibly strong people. Nurses received the Silver Star after 72 consecutive hours of surgery, no coffee break. Reading the transcript of that woman who tried handing back her Silver Star because I was just doing my duty. She admits they thought of taking the coffee break, but there were 200 litters of men lined up in the rain outside, and she was the last nurse and he was the last doctor, and they said, let's keep doing surgery. Tough stuff they were made of.
What's next for you?
Yes, my second novel is complete. My second novel is in to my agent. HarperCollins has asked me to stay in World War II because I spent so much time researching it. Now I can just write about that from different points of view. Second one is set in Tuscany. The Etruscan tombs, the Etruscans, for the history majors here, predate the Romans, right? Very, very ancient stuff. And they were handy, and they were great for bomb shelters. And so that's where people went. I had the incredible good luck to go into one this past summer with my daughter. Take notes, take pictures, just immerse myself. That inky coldness as you sink down those steps into a 3,000-4,000 year old tomb. It's amazing. But as the Italians, who were relentlessly bombed by the US and Britain in an attempt to get them to choose sides, Japan, Italy, Germany were the Axis powers that your grandparents or great-grandparents were fighting against, right? Italy withdrew from the Axis powers, but did not exactly join us. So there was that 1 year about that was very, very hard on the Italian people, who had no say, of course. They had 4 puppet governments going on simultaneously. So to seek shelter, you'd hide in your Etruscan tombs that were underneath your house or the restaurants. And in this novel, you have Allied and Axis and civilian journalists, men and women, all seeking shelter in the same exact tomb, and that's the setup for that story. But thank you, Jenny. Sorry, I'm not playing favorites. These are my son's best friends.
Why novels?
Why not? Why novels? I started out with poetry. Not exactly true. I started out with a novel when I was 9 because my father, who's sitting here, and I were watching a terrible sitcom about vampire barbers, and he said, you could write something better than that, and I took him at his word. And for the computer science majors, the old computers were a brown screen with orange characters that would burn through the glass if you didn't turn your computer off. You have screensavers now. You don't need screensavers. There's no heat coming off of that. It would literally burn through. So I wrote a novel about myself being a Mexican bandit that is still unfinished. Then I went to poetry. I was a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe, Rudyard Kipling, British imperialism aside. For me, it's the best way to get inside people's heads. I have a lot of respect for my son when he has to write a script, his TV film. I go, okay, well, just say that he's really feeling this, this, and this. He's like, we can't do that. We can only show people doing things. Like, ooh, can't get inside their head. That'd be hard for me. Best way to show what people are thinking, especially with a novel like this, so much of it is happening inside people's heads. 2 heroines, 2 different theaters of war. There actually were 3 theaters of war, right? China, Burma, and India. That got edited out, unfortunately. But 2 novels, 2 women in 2 different theaters. In Europe, as I mentioned, grueling, continuous labor. A little older than you guys, so 25, 26. Your hair turns white and your back teeth fall out from malnutrition and just sheer incredible labor. You're an old woman, 26. But it just never stops. It's relentless. We go to North Africa, Sicily, hit Anzio in Italy, and then push our way up through France, going for Germany itself. It's a never-ending ride of crazy, crazy activity. Pacific, the nurses who were already there, all taken prisoner of war really early in the war, in May of 42. So what your war is like is sitting in an internment camp from basically the beginning until the last day of the Second World War, no mail from home, no newspapers. You don't know how the war is going. You don't know if your family's alive. You don't know if Manila, where you are, is the last speck on the map we're fighting over and the rest of the world has fallen. For them, it's a mind game to stay sane, as you starve to death. Some actuarian thought to take a lot of data, a lot of numbers, and these are things I studied in my research. Someone thought to take weight upon capture for U.S. Army and Navy nurses, weight upon capture, weight upon liberation. Girls were not big in 1942. I can't wear vintage clothing because I lift and swim the butterfly. My back is way too big. These are little girls. 125 pounds was very heavy. Weight upon capture, 125 pounds, perfect health. Because remember, perfect health is a requirement to get to the Pacific. Weight upon liberation, 74. The Japanese were cruel to these women. They just had to stay sane. But novel, to answer your question, Emma, novel, because I can show action, I can show activity, but I can also show what you're thinking. Other questions? My dad.
You mentioned the Geneva Convention. What was the difference between Europe and Japan?
Good question. Difference, Geneva Conventions and difference between the theaters of war. Geneva Convention is playing fair. You kind of agree to the rules before you play a game, right? And this is the game we're going to play. White cross means airfield, you can attack that. Red cross means hospital, off limits. It's like base. It's like playing tag, right? Germany, if you were a white female officer, okay, there's a huge double standard, of course, in Europe. If you were a Jew, if you were homosexual, if you were, you go down the list of subhuman people who are going to be sent off to places. But if I'm coming across as a white, middle-class, well-educated officer, I am a first or second lieutenant. I have a snazzy uniform. And I'm taken prisoner of war by the Germans. They don't know what to do with me. They have no counterpart in their army. There's no women in the German army. They had Krankenschwesters, which were not part of the military, kind of like a volunteer nursing corps, but they dressed like these cute little nuns, like really heavy traditional garments with veils and everything. They were a neat group. They would be a good book. Because they weren't military, they figured they weren't bound by Geneva Conventions and they could kill people. So they would run out with machine guns and shoot. It was crazy. I don't get them, but they're neat. But to answer your question, Dad, the Germans would, at a different time, ask you for your word of honor not to try to escape, Gina. Just, and as because you're an officer and we want to show you respect, would you promise to just go over here to this orphanage and act as a nurse? until the war's over, and then we'll send you home. Then you say yes, and that's it. Different. Red Cross comfort kits, with these kits sent by the American Red Cross to keep you alive. Fatty meat, crackers, bar of chocolate, some coffee, a razor so you could shave and feel like a human again, a little cake of soap. Those all got through. The Germans let those through. If you're a prisoner of war, you get your comfort kit. None got through Japan. That's not true. A couple got through. The internees would sell theirs for $3,000, $4,000 for a comfort kit. In the Pacific, the Japanese did not respect the Geneva Convention. A Red Cross was just an easy target. So those nurses who were doing jungle medicine, surgery in the jungle, would come out and scream at the sky because they just would blow up all the patients they just put back together again. An armband. If you are a chaplain, if you are a doctor, a nurse, a non-combatant, it's like a game. We can't kill you, right? In the Pacific, they ripped those off so the snipers wouldn't peg them. Very, very different theater of war. I think most people know the Japanese do not take injured prisoners of war, which is in violation of the Geneva Convention. So these nurses, they did not want to leave their men. In fact, in all my research, no nurse ever left a patient except one time, right before Bataan fell. America was in retreat. We had 4,000 injured. The nurses were all heading south with them. Japan was coming in, 250,000 strong, well rationed and equipped, coming down from the north quickly. They were 5 miles behind, and the men asked the women to leave, and they said absolutely not, because no nurse can leave your patient. That's against your promises. That's against what you stand for as a nurse, a military nurse. When the nurses were told you have to leave, they wouldn't. When the Japanese were 2 miles behind, under threat of court-martial, they got those nurses on the vans. They asked them, just don't die right here in front of us, please. And of course, those men, the men who could march, went on the Bataan Death March. And none of their patients did. So that's a small difference between Germany and Japan's treatment. JP.
Could you talk at all about the process of, I guess, the written instruction you have in a computer to getting something like that published? Like, could you expand on that a little bit more?
You mean like selling it, or do you mean the actual typing part?
Selling it.
Okay. It's really, really hard to do. Dr. McKnight was telling me earlier just how hard it is. It's not 1 in a million. My agent told me it's 2 in 1 million is your odds of selling a debut novel. My advice to you is the same advice I gave to the Writing Society. Just always have your best work ready, because you never know when your break's going to come. My break came because my aunt knew a friend who was going to have lunch with Simon & Schuster the next day. Do you have a copy of your manuscript? Yeah, it's right in my car. I will get that for you. So always have your best work done. As far as practically speaking, no publishing house will work with an author. You need a go-between, which is an agent. So you get yourself an agent, and then that person can sell then to different publishing houses, can sell the movie rights, that kind of thing. But yeah, gone are the days of unsolicited manuscripts just piling up. You kind of have to get an agent, and then they try to fit you with the best possible place. I was extremely fortunate to sell my book that quickly. I think it is well written, but I also think no one had ever heard the story before. So it kind of just sold itself in that way.
Now you said that you grew up with like an hour and a half every day in the midst of being a homeschool mom and everything that you were doing. Did you have a systematic approach to getting into it every day for such a short amount of time?
No, it was more or less just like quickly escaping and jumping on my bed and typing as fast as I can was really it. My kids are really, really good. They kind of know when the mania has come upon me. And so they know like to microwave like corn dogs and stuff to survive the onslaught of mom writing. But I really only could get these little chunks of time. So I would have an idea kind of where I wanted to go, but not so much a plan. Sorry. Somebody else.
You should all know then, before we conclude this evening, that the book is in its 3rd printing, and it is on the bestsellers list in Canada, and I predict next week we'll make the bestsellers list in the United States. So this is one of ours, and please thank her for coming.